am not going to talk so much about the electorate as my colleagues have. I'm going to talk about the quality of polling that's being done during the campaign, and in particular, some concerns I have about the quality of polling and what I believe is the increased likelihood of polling errors by the end of the campaign. So there's a lot of polling being done. These are the latest entries in the Real Clear Politics website. These are 3 national polls conducted in the last few days. You can see the first one is a poll conducted by Rasmussen Reports. It shows Clinton with a 1-point lead. There's a poll conducted for NBC News, and it shows Clinton with a 6-point lead. And a poll that's being reported daily, actually, for the LA Times and the University of Southern California, which shows Trump with a 4-point lead. So this is, first of all, what I mean by variability, but my main concern and the central issue that I want to talk about today is why do these differences occur, and what do they mean for estimation at the end of the campaign. Pollsters who are operating in the contemporary environment face a number of issues. The first and most important are the problems that are arising in the survey research world itself. I'll say a little bit more about these, about response rates, about types of data collection, and so on. Secondly is the fact that pre-election polls actually involve a 2-step estimation process in which the pollster has to first estimate who is going to go to the polls, and then among those who go to the polls, the so-called likely voter models, what their preferences are going to be. The third point is that every pre-election pollster, everybody who is estimating the outcome of an election uses a set of assumptions or models that typically are derived from results in previous elections. The question is, what happens if things in the world change and the models that we've been using in the past don't apply any longer? And then, of course, there are some special issues of the current campaign. My colleagues on the panel have talked about some of these in terms of attitudinal differences, demographic differences, and so on, and I want to talk about those as well. I think it's important to acknowledge as well as to emphasize that there have been a set of economic pressures present in the media world, and you remember that most of the polls that we see have a media sponsor, and whatever the results are, they're promoted in the media. And these pressures come primarily from declining classified advertising revenue, economic pressures that can, in the past, for example, result in some news organizations eliminating their polling units. There's a discussion now about whether or not, for example, CBS News and the New York Times will persist in their collaboration beyond the election. They also have to do with the use of new technologies for data collection and the consequences of those for data quality. More generally, in the field of survey research, we've been going through a period of declining response rates. In this audience in particular, I don't have to dwell on this at any great length. We know that there are technological reasons for this, that there are cultural reasons about the way people conduct their daily lives. One other issue, though, is the consequences or the impact of this for sample quality. And by that, I mean, first of all, whether or not the samples are demographically representative. You've heard a fair amount of discussion earlier about the gender gap. I'm interested in the question of whether or not the ratio of women to men in a poll varies from one poll to another. I'm going to talk a little bit in a moment about party identification. So the mix of Republicans, Democrats, and independents in a poll, or the racial composition of a sample are important. We also know that the way in which telephone polls incorporate cell phone respondents in their samples, and the ratio of cell phones that are combined with landline phones is also important because of characteristics that are associated with who owns a cell phone and uses a cell phone as opposed to those who don't. And then there are questions about web panels, non-probability samples, and the use of statistical models to estimate, for example, the likely electorate. This is the result of a very interesting experiment that we have seen for the first time, in which the New York Times and Siena College conducted a poll in Florida, and they used a different sampling technique. They used a list of registered voters to begin with, and the Times wrote a story about the results based upon their own analysis of the data. But the experiment was to turn the data over to 4 different pollsters and ask them to generate estimates of the outcome using their own set of assumptions and models. So this is different than what I was just talking about, different samples, different compositional issues. This is the same data set, but different statistical parameters applied to it. Charles Franklin is a Michigan PhD, now is working at Marquette in the law school, organizing a polling operation. Patrick Ruffini is a Republican pollster. Penshone and Berland are Democratic pollsters. And then there's a group that includes Corbett Davies, Gelman, and Rothschild, who applied statistical models to the same data. And I just draw your attention to the estimates on the far right, which are the margin from the different estimates. The New York Times originally reported that Clinton was ahead by 1 point in Florida based upon these data. And you can see that Franklin estimated a 3-point margin, the Democratic firm a 4-point margin, the Republican firm a 1-point margin, and the statistical model using the data was a 1-point advantage for Trump. The point of this is only to suggest that assumptions are worth a lot, and the models that you use are worth a lot, and especially in the current campaign, we ought to be rounding up as much information as we can, not only about the sample composition, but also about the weighting algorithms and the other parameters that are being applied to the data. This is a chart. It's got a lot of numbers in it, but I'm just going to point you to the bottom of the final pre-election estimates in the 2012 election. And you can see that most of the firms estimated that Barack Obama would win the election. You can see that the estimated margins are relatively small. In fact, there were 2 estimates that said that Mitt Romney would win the election. The actual vote count was 3.7 percentage points Democratic victory, the margin for Obama. There's a pretty systematic bias in the final pre-election estimates in 2012, underestimating Barack Obama's victory margin. Why is that? And there are a variety of possible explanations for this. One of them could be the ratio of whites and minorities in the sample. One thing that's interesting and goes to the point about using old models is these are turnout rates by race and ethnicity. And the 2012 election was the first election in which the turnout rate of blacks, African Americans, was higher than the turnout rate of whites. So if you were a pre-election pollster in 2012 estimating the outcome of the election based upon what your experience had been in polling in 2008 and in 2004, one way in which you could have underestimated Barack Obama's margin of victory was you didn't weight the preferences of African Americans highly enough. And as you can recall from the prior presentations about current data, but also data from 2012, just about every African American who went to the polls cast a vote for Barack Obama. So if you didn't have the right proportion in the total sample, especially if you had too few African Americans, you're underestimating Barack Obama's average. Another possibility is that a national sample underrepresents the populations in the battleground states. In 2012, turnout dropped from 2008 in the country as a whole, and actually in most states. It actually ticked up a little in the battleground states. But the samples that pollsters use don't account differentially for battleground states and non-battleground states. This is a website. This is a picture of a website that's just been started by Ken Goldstein, who's also a former Michigan PhD, for Bloomberg Politics. This is called a Bloomberg Politics Poll Decoder. It's a very interesting representation of data. I have a static picture of it for you here. This is the margin in different polls for groups that tend to lean towards Clinton. And you heard parts of two presentations prior to mine about the gender gap and the importance of the difference between men and women. So if you go down to the bottom row in the chart, these are the estimates of the Clinton margin among women in 8 different polls. And the average across these polls is 13.5 percentage points. It's somewhere between or around the estimates that Tasha and Nick were talking about in terms of data from 2016 or data from prior elections. But the leftmost dot, which I have now inserted a text box around, comes from a McClatchy-Marist poll where the preference of women for Clinton over Trump is 23 percentage points. And the little box on the right, which is from a Quinnipiac poll, shows net preference among women for Clinton over Trump of plus 5 percentage points. If the polls are producing estimates of differences by subgroup of this magnitude, this means that it's, to me, that it's very likely that some things are going to go bad at the end of the campaign. I mentioned something about special issues in the current campaign, and again, my colleagues have made reference to this, but I just want to remind you that in this campaign we have 2 of the most disliked candidates in recent American electoral history. That is measured in terms of favorability. They both have net negative favorability. The polls are measuring very low levels of enthusiasm for voting, and we expect this to be a low turnout election, certainly lower turnout than in 2012, I think, and guaranteed to be less than in 2008. That places additional pressure on the likely voter models that the pollsters are using. It's also a matter of these assumptions or models, especially as they either relate to weighting or to the use of a likely voter algorithm, and whether or not the models that have been successful in past elections will apply to the current set of campaign circumstances. And then there are these issues, especially the ones that Nick referenced, that are important in this current campaign, which we haven't seen before. But I want to mention 2 other things. This is a chart from a piece that Marty Wattenberg published in the Washington Post maybe a week or so ago. And this is the personal trait ratings for presidential candidates, where the green line is the winning candidate and the purple line is the losing candidate. And it's the difference between positive comments and negative comments. And you can see generally the decline in positive evaluations of both the winning candidate and the losing candidate over the last several elections. These are ANES data. And this is a chart that comes actually out of a tweet this morning by Hans Noel, which is the proportion of partisans who support their candidate in a presidential election, with leaners included in the partisans. And you can see in the 60s and early 70s, the proportion of Democrats who supported their party's nominee dropped. But in the period of polarization on the right side of the chart, you can see that there's a return to the strength of party identification as a correlate of vote choice. And I think this is attributable to not only the differences between parties, but partisans coming to understand what it means to be a member of their party and what it means to be a member of the other party, and the intense dislike that's growing among partisans for people of the other kind. Stuart mentioned motivated reasoning, and we've actually been conducting some experiments about how people evaluate the accuracy and the credibility of polls. And this is from a piece that actually appeared in the Monkey Cage in the Washington Post this morning. And it is the result of an experiment in which we had stimuli that had polls described as of different quality, but these are polls of equivalent quality. And two polls were presented in order of a Trump lead and a Clinton lead of the same margin. Most people understood that the polls were of equal quality. But for those who didn't, about 1/3, you can see that the Republicans thought that the poll that showed Trump ahead was more accurate. That's the big red bar. And on the right side, to a slightly lesser degree, you can see that Democrats thought that the poll that showed Hillary Clinton was ahead was the more accurate. So this is an example of not only motivated reasoning in the interpretation of data, but I think this will also have some consequence at the end of the campaign when people begin to develop attitudes and feelings about whether the right person won, whether the vote was rigged, other issues about the legitimacy of the outcome. So where does this lead the pollsters? I think that unless what Nate Silvers called herding, we have a great collapsing of estimation to some kind of common figure, more or less, that there'll be a lot of variation in the estimates of the pollsters, and that some of them will be relatively far off. It's unlikely that there'll be many public pollsters who will say, I think as of now, that Donald Trump will win. And one of the big criteria for evaluating pollsters is, first of all, whether they get the right winner. But for those of us who are methodologists, we think the real number is how close to the actual margin or to each candidate's showing in the vote count will they be. And I think there'll be a lot of variation there. Thank you very much.